Welcome to the EdVenture Brief, the podcast designed to help you learn more about the startup ecosystem in Scotland. The EdVenture Brief is brought to you by the managing team of EdVenture, Zara, Ragnar, Finn, and me, Shannon. We're Scotland's first student-led accelerator program, bringing the university's most talented people and ideas together to build real-world startups and build long-lasting networks through our accelerator program. Each week, we choose a topic and invite a successful startup founder or VC onto the show to talk about their journey and experiences. Exciting startups will be showcased, as well as interviewing experienced domain experts in AI, biotech, and academic staff from our university.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Today we have Dr. Bernard Olayo, founder and chairman of the Center of Public Health and Development, who is also the founder of Hewatele and other social enterprises. He will talk about his experience with social enterprises and also like in the context of coronavirus, and we'll later enlarge a bit more abstractly about the concept of social entrepreneurship. And at the end, as usual, we can just ask some questions either directly or in the chat as you want. I'll just pass the word on to you.
Thanks everyone. My name is Bernard Olayo. I'm from Kenya, based in Nairobi, but I work a lot across African countries. I started my career as a physician within the Ministry of Health in Kenya and did that for around 6 years before I went into public health. And I was driven into public health mainly because of some of the challenges that I was seeing while working as a physician in the public sector. At that time, and that was maybe around the year 2000, there wasn't so much in other areas except HIV, TB, and malaria. So most of the public health programming were around those areas. But as you may know from your reading, those are not by any chance the leading causes of mortality or death in our setting. If you look at, for example, in children under 5, the number one cause of their death is pneumonia, and not HIV, not TB, and not malaria. And pneumonia cannot be treated without oxygen. So we did set up this crucible, a place where we could do crazy things that we like, that address some of the, what I would consider to be neglected areas. And I did that because there was no other place that was open to me to do this thing. So about social entrepreneurship, sometimes you are forced by circumstances to create something to allow you to play. You create your own league if the other club cannot allow you to play. Because as I tried to talk to other people and see, can we address some of these other challenges? They said, no, that's not part of our program. That's not part of the donor priority. That's not part of the government's priorities. But on the ground, I could see the need. So everything that we've done is about building or bridging the gaps in areas that we think are neglected and not being addressed, and using local solutions. So that's how I ended up with Hewatele, to try and address something that I felt needed to be done for most of the people that were vulnerable. And we didn't want to do it with grant funding purely because you can get finished. So we thought maybe having a small business that is self-sustaining, that generates revenue, that everybody's a winner. The hospitals have more reliable supply. They pay a lower price, and we raise enough revenue to keep the program going, would be one way to go. So that's what Hewatele is really all about. But if I could just explain the whole wording for it. That's first of all, the phrase is Swahili, which is a language spoken in East Africa. Hewa simply means air, and tele means plentiful. So the goal is to bridge the oxygen gap. We don't really have a Swahili word for oxygen. That's why we picked the closest word, which is air, to signify to the market that our goal is to provide or to bridge the oxygen gap by ensuring that we have adequate supply and nobody goes without it. That started in 2014. We didn't know that it would find value in COVID. So when we had the pandemic reach our shores at the beginning of this year, we just adjusted our working schedules, had more teams working 24 hours a day to meet demand that has obviously gone much higher because of COVID that is now with us even here in Kenya. But let me shut up for a moment and see if someone has a question. I have lots of stories to tell, but I want to make sure that I'm telling the right stories. So your questions can help me be more specific in my responses.
If anyone has a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself. Otherwise, you can also write in the chat. But otherwise, I had written down some questions as well. So what was the incentive really for you to start Hewatele and your other social enterprises?
So it's mainly, as I indicated to you, I'm a physician and a public health specialist. So I had a problem that I dealt with for many years. And through my studies and work, I had come across solutions. The initial solutions didn't work very well, but subsequently we cracked it and were able to, find a solution. So I think we started with a problem, and there was certainly commercial value in investing in this area because oxygen in Africa costs, or before our engagement, costs approximately, I would say, 13 times what it costs in North America, and maybe 10 times what it costs in Europe. So these are poor patients, but they're paying such a high price for such an essential commodity. And by the way, the raw material for making oxygen is just the air we breathe. So you don't really need a lot of stuff to make it. You just need to apply the science and then it works. So that's why we felt that there's value addition in us disrupting this market by simplifying the production, making it closer to hospitals that need it. And it has worked quite well for us since then.
And why would you say oxygen is so much more expensive in Kenya than in North America?
There are many factors, but like in any business, the price of a commodity, of course, depends on your cost of production and your appetite for a reasonable profit. But many times when you're a monopoly, there's a greed factor. I mean, you can charge, and we've seen this with pharmaceutical sector, we've seen it with other areas. When there's no competition, you charge whatever you feel you should charge. So that's the main challenge.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat from Akira Martine. She asked, Martine, I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong, what were the main obstacles you faced when you started the project?
The main obstacle, I think, for me was just convincing the clients that this is actually a good product. There's normally a mystery in all these things, in that for many years, there's a multinational that produced oxygen in the country and supplied everyone and charged whatever they want. Then you have this crazy guy coming up saying, I can also produce it. So the first question is that people say, oh, but it's so cheap. Is it really good? Sometimes I had to breathe my own oxygen to convince people that it won't kill them. So changing the perception of the consumer, I think, to me was a major challenge at the beginning. But afterwards, I think now our product has been accepted in the market.
Okay. On that note, she followed up with a question if this enterprise only operates in Nairobi or in other places as well.
So we didn't actually start in Nairobi. We started it's mainly targeting underserved rural hospitals. So our first plant was in Western Kenya in a rural county called Siaya. Then we have one in Nakuru in the Rift Valley and the third one in Nairobi. So we have 3 factories that are meeting the needs of around 200 hospitals now. Through other partnerships, we have the idea now spreading into Ethiopia. We'll be setting up in Uganda as well. And there's another partner of ours that is operating in Rwanda.
Okay, thank you. And how would you describe the role that Hewatele played in alleviating the consequences of coronavirus, and how did the way that Hewatele works change following coronavirus?
So for people who get coronavirus, 80% of them will have no symptoms at all. They'll get it, they'll recover, they'll never know they had it. For the remaining 20%, a vast majority again will have very mild symptoms. And then you have approximately just 5% that get really sick. Now, for the people who get sick, certainly to save them, they need oxygen. Everybody needs oxygen. For a very small percentage that require ventilation, those are the people that go into the ICU. But even in the ICU, the number one treatment is oxygen before you add anything else. So we try to give people oxygen early so that they don't get into this point where they require ventilation, because globally, the people who progress to the point of getting into ICU, the mortality is more than 90%. So by the time you require ventilation, the outcome is terrible. So we think this is actually the number one drug for anybody with COVID that develops symptoms. And as you saw from the case of the British Prime Minister, if they treat him early on oxygen, he didn't require ventilation and went back to work after some time. So it's very central to management of COVID-19 symptoms. But not just that, but other respiratory diseases that require supplemental oxygen. This is normally the game changer.
I have a question. As a non-profit, what would you say are the key challenges you face specifically compared to for-profit organizations, or perhaps even like the social enterprises as well? One of the other questions that came up was where does your funding come from? So I guess funding might also be one of the issues.
We have mixed sources of funding. So you start generally with maybe a grant, and then you get some cheaper loans. So most of what we are using right now are concessional loans from international financial institutions like Grand Challenges Canada or UBS Foundation. And many foundations are now making these concessional, affordable loans that you can use to build an enterprise. But before you can generate some history or a record that allows you to get that loan, you need an initial grant to just get you started. We've also been able to leverage funding from local governments here in Kenya. So for some of the plans, we have funding from government to contribute towards setup of the plant in the areas while guaranteeing them cheaper oxygen. So they're able to invest some 30-70, we bring in 70%, they pay 30%, and we set up the operation there. But the next phase is mostly investment out of the revenue that we've accrued from the initial set of operations.
And what do you think are the most pressing issues in kind of the public health infrastructure apart from oxygen supply, and that should be tackled very soon as well?
There are many of them. I think one which is intractable is really on the human resource side of it. How the availability of well-trained health workers. I think that's an area that we still see the gap. Even with the oxygen, we still struggle with making sure that we train people and they can use the technology working. For most part, the other technologies are available. You can find the broad range from the top brand from Germany or the US to cheaper functional ones from China or India. So you have the whole range of technology available. Now, the main challenge in my view is how you get health workers trained in good enough numbers and with adequate skills to meet the needs, particularly in the rural areas, because smart doctors, like anywhere else in the world, they want to stay in London, Nairobi, New York. They don't want to go to areas that are not as interesting, with the amenities that middle class people want to enjoy. So if there was a way to train and deploy or even use technology to enhance the competencies of primary care workers in remote settings, I think that's something that would greatly enhance the quality of services that people get.
Do you think that AI will provide a kind of opportunity to tap into that space where there's a lack of human resource and this kind of brain drain to the more lucrative city or urban centers, that maybe via remote technology and AI that we could maybe fix that issue?
Yes, I think it is. I'm not an AI expert, but I read about it a lot before I go to bed frequently. And there are lots of very interesting innovations that are coming up. There are areas that are moving much faster than others. For example, in radiology now, You have a lot of, I mean, it's probably the most advanced. We have areas in cardiology that you can basically get an idiot to take an ECG and the system will report it for you. So I think it's a promising area. I don't know what will be the changes in the next 5 years. I'm 47 years old. And what I've seen is that every 5 years, there's such a major transformation that when you look back 5 years ago, even at your iPhone that was there 5 years ago, it looks like it was made in 1640. The technology changes so fast. So I'm optimistic about technology and AI coming in to solve some of these problems.
Okay, I think we have another question in the chat. When deciding to implement Hewatele, what kind of government regulations, especially in terms of health, did you have to abide with?
A lot of them. Luckily, I'd worked within the Ministry of Health, so I knew the ropes. So generally, the technology that we're using to produce medical grade oxygen has to comply to some international standards. So in this case, we chose to go with the technology that complies to the FDA regulations. So it's FDA approved and meets the EU standards. And therefore, adapting it for local regulatory standards was much easier because of these are the international approvals that were already there. But when you get into the country, of course, you get lots and lots of licenses that you have to comply with, the construction licenses, just the normal trade licensing, environmental licenses, so many of them. But if you plan ahead, you just overcome them. I don't think there's a major barrier really. It's just that it takes time to comply.
Okay, thank you. On that note, obviously, although it's a social enterprise, there's still competition. So Martin asked to what extent the market was competitive when you decided to start this enterprise, and with the current situation with coronavirus and the increase in demand for oxygen, if competition is increasing and what kind of strategies you're planning on to work on that.
The response from our competition was quite classic. The first was they offered me some money to just shut down this initiative and go away. Yeah. When I told them, but this is not what we wanted to do. We were not trying to make money. We were trying to solve a problem here. So the next response that we saw was a more aggressive push through the government to imply that whatever we were producing was not meeting the standards. So again, we had to work very hard with the Kenya Bureau of Standards and the regulatory bodies to ensure that at least we have our commodity tested and we have all these records, so nobody can question the quality of it. So, but this is something you would expect in any setting, that once you start eating into their market share, there will be a response, and the response sometimes can be very aggressive. Right now, we are seeing a major change in that all the other major players are also reducing their prices and offering better services to the clients, eliminating some of the old redundant fees like cylinder leasing fees that didn't add value at all to the patients' welfare. So despite us meeting the needs of our core health facilities, there's a lot of changes that we are seeing in the oxygen market that are positive.
Would you say it's more difficult for a social enterprise to compete with other companies than for a regular enterprise?
Certainly, because they have much more money than a social enterprise. So in terms of marketing or distorting the market with false information, they have a lot more power than you do. And if you're not convinced about what you're trying to do, they can offer you a price that is 10 times what you're trying to build. You need some convictions to resist that, to continue doing what you're trying to do.
Okay. With a future outlook, where do you see Hewatele, for example, in 5 years, or maybe as much as after the coronavirus crisis? Where do you see Hewatele in the future?
So what has happened more recently is that there's a lot of interest in the business from private equity firms, other lenders. So it might be that we get significant investment from some of the suitors that are looking at us, and then we get to grow significantly to other areas. So right now, we are at that tipping point where there are many interested parties that want to invest through debt, but also to take a stake in the business. So think in the next 5 years, it might be very different if we get significant investment coming in.
Would you say that this increase in interest, there was a trend before coronavirus, or was this, say, started by the coronavirus crisis, that, for example, private equity companies are more interested in actually broadening their portfolio in this direction?
All the interests I've gotten are post-coronavirus.
Okay.
So I would say it has brought more attention towards oxygen and respiratory devices, and having an ongoing concern in that area makes it attractive to potential investors.
Okay.
Do you think that the financial interest of the private equity firms will stand in the way of Hewatele's mission to improve the situation rather than just make money out of the situation?
Yes, that's possible, but we are being very selective on who we can partner with, so that we only want to work with people who are mission aligned with our primary goal. So we don't want to compromise the original vision that we had. So we're balancing both the financial and then the social goals as well.
Okay, thank you. We have another question in the chat from Momin. Does a social enterprise have an edge in long term due to the fact that you're making a positive impact to the community?
Yes, I think so, because what I've seen, for example, when coronavirus pandemic was spreading in Kenya, as a social enterprise, there's a bit of trust that the key players, the government, the donors, and the UN agencies had. They talk to us not more as a business, but as an important partner that is contributing to their mission as well. So we get a bit more fairer treatment from the government than a traditional private business.
Okay. We had another question. If the production costs from Hewatele are covered by the market demands both before and after coronavirus?
Yes, so by the time coronavirus, we've been a profitable business for the last 4 years. So Corona found us already fairly stable.
Okay. And on a bigger scale, would you say there's like globally, not only within Kenya, there's a trend towards social entrepreneurship in the last few years? So did you observe any trend in this direction in the last few years?
What I've seen are the changes, favorable changes towards social entrepreneurship globally, because when you look at the traditional funders, they're all moving away from giving grants. No, nobody wants to just write a check, poverty alleviation, for managing diarrhea or malaria. They're looking at how can we address this using a business approach. So there's a lot of value in we're seeing lots and lots of changes in that space. And also when you look at the large multinationals, the pharmaceutical sector and other health businesses, they're also adopting approach. They have a window within their businesses that specifically addresses the needs of the social enterprises. And I'm seeing the same right now, even with the large financial institutions like UBS Bank, where they are putting aside a part of their business that is strictly dedicated to social enterprises, or large foundations like Gates Foundation that are now looking at this space. So it's something that I don't know if it will be sustained in the long run, but there's a lot of interest in social enterprises contributing to addressing the global development needs.
I'm not sure if it's something you can disclose, but because you mentioned Gates Foundation, did they get involved in Hewatele? Because I saw also that there was this video where Bill Gates made a YouTube video about heroes in the field. So did the Bill Gates Foundation get involved with Hewatele at all, if you're allowed to disclose that?
No, I'm allowed to discuss that, and that's I'm answering that question for 100th time this week.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, so they have never financed Hewatele, and generally for him to showcase such a product, he cannot showcase something that they're financed, because he would be blowing his own trump. So ethically, they look at just promising innovation that they have had no investments in. And the way they did that video was that someone called me from Gates Ventures and say, hey, I need to talk to you. I'm from Gates Ventures. I said, yeah, I get lots of people calling me to say they're from Gates something. So please, can you leave me alone? So then the next day they called our office line and said, no, we're not scammers. We're really serious. We need to do this video. So we have had no funding from them for Hewatele. Hopefully in future they will.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I have a question more generally. Like, as a founder, what would you say your two biggest mistakes were? If you could go back in time when founding, what would you do differently?
If I had not founded Hewatele at this time, I would never have found it. So there was a time in my life when I had the energy, I had the belief, I had this spirit that you can transform everything. In other words, you need to be a bit naive to start something. Like the things that I started when I was much younger, I can't do them right now with the kind of information that I have. I think age plays a role in this. In your younger years, you're much more risk-taking and every challenge is surmountable. It's a short window in your professional life when this can happen before you get a lot more experience and realistic and see so many failures. And at that time, we could fail and start again. But right now, anything that I'm going into, I really have to analyze the risk because I want to avoid failure so much that it stops one from thinking now. What would I do differently? I think I would have started a little bit earlier. Maybe would have made much more progress and maybe dreamt a little bigger. We could be somewhere much, much further. I don't think the problem that we chose is different. I would still choose the same problem because of just the number of people who are affected.
And for founders who want to start a social enterprise, who have a startup and want to have a positive social impact, what would be tips or recommendation that you could give these founders?
There's something called analysis paralysis. Don't wait to have all the data before you start, because if you do that, you'll never start. Just have enough information that can allow you to get started, and you start small, an initial small investment where you are ready to lose that money. It's like paying tuition. So let me try it, see if it works. If it doesn't work, you count that loss and go back and redesign. So that way you'll be able to fail fast or see chances of success first, and then you can grow it. Don't start with $1 million. Start with a much smaller testing of what your idea is. And then I think the most important aspect that you need to consider is who's your client? Who are you trying to help? Is this something that they're willing to buy into? Because if they're not, however beautiful the idea is, then you're not going to go anywhere. So identifying your market, I would call it a market, not so much of a client that you're trying to play in, would be useful.
Okay, thank you.
Also in East Africa, what do you think is kind of the best place to grow a venture in terms of the infrastructure and ecosystem? Because you also have kind of thriving communities in Rwanda, Uganda. So in East Africa, what would be the best place to really grow this venture or in general?
So I'll give you an extremely biased statement because I am based in Nairobi, and I've had people say that it's the best place to start anything like this, which I think is true to a large extent because it has so many people from all over the world that are trying to build different solutions. Because whatever you're trying to do, you will need complementary support from IT, from finance, from all these different subsectors to help you understand your problem and sort it out. And so that puts Nairobi ahead of the other East African countries. I would say that my best place to visit in East Africa is Kampala. But if I want to do business in Kampala, I will struggle because there will be so many things missing that I would easily just get next door if I was in Nairobi. But the problems that need to be solved are the same. Now, if you're looking at East Africa, where the biggest problems that anybody needs to do something about, just across the border in Somalia, is one area that is 50 years behind everyone else, and they will need lots of solutions in different sectors. And a lot of people are doing stuff in Somalia from Nairobi. In fact, we may be going into Somalia with our Hewatele solution from our base here in Nairobi. So it's possible to reach within the 2-hour flight out of Nairobi, you can reach many places with the solutions from here. And if you're French speaking, then Congo, DR Congo, is another place that is so underserved and would really benefit from some of these innovations. Unfortunately, I don't speak much French beyond bonjour, so I've not been able to do much. yeah.
Okay, thank you. Shannon has been raising her hand for a long time, so I'm just gonna ask her now to.
Yeah, sure. So I have like a few questions regarding your company. So do you think the onset of COVID has definitely helped your company to gain traction as it received support not only from the Kenyan government, but also from like international actors such as the UN, or like I think you've gotten recognition from Bill Gates as well. So can you also detail their involvement with you? And also, do you think your company has the opportunity to go public, which would be the perfect profile for like investment management companies? And firms that have like ESG centric focuses, because your company is very much in line with like the SDG goals.
I think COVID and the attention that Oxygen has received, and the coalition that we've been part of, the Oxygen Coalition for some time, I think did help to bring us to the fore so that many players learned about our work. We've done lots of interviews, we've submitted lots and lots of responses to requests for people who are thinking about working with us. Now, whether it contributes to our investments, I think will take time. Generally, development financing, from the time you start talking to a funder to the point when you get the money into your account to do whatever you want to do, is a minimum of 1 year. And I don't think COVID has changed that very much. So we're still pursuing leads for partnerships for growth with a lot of new partners that have come up at this time of COVID. But at least it did help that a lot of people got to know about our work, and therefore we don't have to explain to new partners a lot about the work that we do. About going public, I think it's still we can have that discussion in another 5 years. Right now, we're just passing that innovation space. We want to go to the growth phase. Maybe we think about, how do we get this thing out of our hands for some other people to run with it by, going public. So I would be willing to look at that maybe in another 5 years' time. But the next 5 years is consolidation and the growth to make it something significant.
Thank you. Makira asked, what kind of incentives do you have for your employees, especially in the case of social enterprise, since the funds may be a bit limited compared to a traditional business model?
Yeah, so what we've done in our business is they are co-owners of the business. So we reduce our appetite for profit and we pay better than our competitors. We also spend a lot of money on their training. So they're all getting really, really well trained and well incentivized to be in their job. But I think what I've learned over the last 10 years is that it's not just enough to pay people well, but to carefully select people who like the mission and want to work with these hospitals to solve their problems. So that HR part, I think, selecting people who want to do this long term, I think is something that I think has helped us a bit. Most of our employees have been with us for quite some time, and we try to put every measure in place to retain them. That does not eliminate the fact that sometimes when you train people very, very well, and a big company comes into town, they will poach them and pay them 4 times what you pay. So that's a risk that we are aware of and we have a plan to deal with. So we always have several layers of people knowing the same thing, so that even if someone moved to a much more lucrative position where we can't stop them, we still have a pipeline of other employees that are ready to step in. So succession planning for key positions is key.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So we had another question. It was, what were some of the largest supply chain challenges?
So during COVID, I think the main challenge that we have is getting things into East Africa. Most of the supplies like high pressure cylinders, we get them from China. With COVID, I think there was a major interruption in supply chain. So things that you typically would get in 2 months, we're waiting for as long as 6 months to get them in. For example, just shipping in parts from the US, service parts for the plants and just consumables for some of the day-to-day repair and maintenance of the plant, it wasn't very easy to fly them in. Now, there are, of course, standard problems that are country specific. So issues, for example, with pre-shipment inspection, where if I'm buying parts from Germany or someplace, the Kenya government requires that we have the parts inspected in the country of origin, and before we ship them into Kenya, that sometimes introduces a lot of delay. Also, if I'm shipping in something that I've never shipped before, then they require me to register it with the regulatory authority, and that sometimes wastes 6 or 8 weeks of your time. But I think overall, we have learned to anticipate those delays and have plans to deal with them.
All right. So thank you so much for coming and taking the time to talk to us. It was really informative and really insightful. And I'm sure the court is really happy about the new insights they got. So thank you so much, Dr. Olayo, for your time.
Yeah, if you are ever in Nairobi, please give me a call. We will have a beer or tea. If you don't.
Yeah.
Perfect. We'll do that.
I was
All right,
born in
thanks.
Nairobi, so I will come.
Thank you. Thank you very much.